Hello everyone, and welcome. Today, I'm excited to introduce our presentation on plant successional climax. We'll explore how plant communities develop and reach their stable, mature states. Over the next few slides, we'll cover the key stages of succession, the factors that influence climax communities, and why understanding this process is so important. Let's get started. So, the relatively stable community that forms at the end of a succession is known as a climax community. This is the stage where the ecosystem reaches a sort of equilibrium with its environment. It's thought to be stable and persistent, lasting until some kind of environmental change occurs, like a flood, fire, windstorm, or climate change. It's important to note that what constitutes a climax community can vary depending on local conditions. For example, in Britain, deciduous woodland is typically considered the climatic climax vegetation, which is a generalization reflecting the typical dominant vegetation in that climate. The idea of climax vegetation helps us understand how ecosystems develop and stabilize over time. It's a key concept because it shows the balance between living communities and their environment, and how that balance can be disturbed or maintained depending on external factors. This concept ties into our overall theme of ecosystem development and stability. So, when we talk about the climax community, we're referring to the final, stable stage of ecological development in a given area. This stage actually corresponds closely to the biome vegetation type, meaning the plant community that dominates at the end of ecological succession. In his view, various factors like soils, topography, fire, and animals are actually interruptions or disturbances that can momentarily alter this progression, but they don't prevent the community from eventually reaching its climax. What's really important here is that Clement's believed climate is the ultimate determinant. It's what sets the conditions for the entire community to develop and establish its final form. So, in the bigger picture, understanding how these factors interact helps us grasp how ecosystems develop and stabilize over time. This slide doesn't contain enough information. That's why we're moving to the next slide. When we talk about climax communities, it's important to recognize that there isn't just one single type that dominates every area. In fact, many regions can support more than one climax community, depending on factors like the local climate, soil, and other environmental conditions. This means that an area might have different stable communities coexisting or existing at different times, each adapted to specific conditions. Understanding this diversity helps us see how ecosystems are more dynamic and complex than we might initially think. It also ties into the broader idea that ecosystems can reach a state of balance, but that balance can take different forms. So, recognizing that multiple climax communities can exist in one area allows us to appreciate the richness and variability of natural environments. Let's talk about succession and how dispersal plays a key role in it. Dispersal is essentially the process by which new species spread to different areas, allowing them to establish and grow. As succession progresses, we see an increase in both the number of species and their abundance, meaning more diverse and populous communities develop over time. It's also interesting to note that early and late successional species have different adaptations suited to their specific environments. Early species are often good at colonizing open spaces and tolerating harsh conditions, while late species tend to be better at competing and thriving in more stable, mature ecosystems. Connecting this all back to our overall theme, understanding these processes helps us grasp how ecosystems develop and maintain their diversity over time. Dispersal and the adaptations of different species are fundamental drivers of ecological succession. Let's explore the different types of successional communities. First, we have facilitation. This is where the presence of one species actually helps other species become established and grow. It's like a positive domino effect. One species creates conditions that make it easier for others to thrive. Next, we have tolerance. In this case, species establish independently of each other. One species doesn't really influence whether another can settle or grow. They coexist without much interaction. Finally, inhibition is when the presence of one species actually retards the establishment and growth of others. It's like a competitive barrier, where one species makes it harder for others to take hold or expand. Understanding these interactions is key to grasping how communities develop and change over time. It shows that succession isn't just a simple, linear process. It's shaped by these complex relationships between species. Now, let's talk about some arresting factors that can influence natural environments and plant succession. First, there are variations in the local area, such as differences in soil, drainage, and relief. For example, in Scotland's upland areas, instead of deciduous woodland, you often find tundra-like characteristics. These local variations can really shape what kind of vegetation and ecosystems develop. Next, we have natural environmental factors. Things like volcanoes, lightning strikes causing fires, mud flows, and hurricanes all play a part in disturbing the landscape. These events can reset succession or create new conditions for plants to colonize. Then, of course, humans are a huge influence. Our activities, farming, building roads, towns, diverting water, constructing dams, alter the environment significantly. These human interventions can either hinder or promote certain types of succession. Finally, it's important to note that climatic climax vegetation, the final, stable stage of succession, may not always be achieved. This is often because plant succession is altered or interrupted, whether by natural events or human activities. When succession is disrupted, ecosystems may remain in an earlier or different stage rather than reaching that stable climax. Now, let's talk about what happens when the natural progression of vegetation is interrupted. If the factors that normally allow climax vegetation to develop are stopped or suppressed, the resulting vegetation is called subclimax vegetation. Essentially, it's a stage where the ecosystem hasn't fully reached its climax because something is holding it back. Most notably, when this interruption is caused by human activities, like farming, deforestation, or urban development, we refer to this as plagioclimax. So, in simple terms, plagioclimax is a type of subclimax that's the result of human influence. The key idea here is that these arresting factors prevent the ecosystem from reaching its natural climax stage. Understanding these influences helps us see how human actions can shape, alter, or even halt natural ecological succession. It's a crucial concept because it highlights the impact we have on ecosystems and their natural development. This slide doesn't contain enough information. That's why we're moving to the next slide. This slide doesn't contain enough information. That's why we're moving to the next slide. Let's talk about the climax stage in plant and community succession. Now, the key idea here is that climax represents the final, most stable stage of succession in a given environment. Think of it as the point where the vegetation has developed into a highly stable and balanced condition. This is when the plant community is essentially in harmony with its environment, and it tends to persist over time without significant changes. According to SAF in 1983, this stage symbolizes the culmination of the succession process. Understanding climax helps us see how ecosystems evolve toward stability and resilience, which ties into the broader theme of ecological succession and habitat development. So, in simple terms, climax is the end game, where everything settles into a steady state. Today, I'll be talking about the different theories of climax in plant ecology. First, let's look at the monoclimax theory. This theory suggests that in any given environment, there tends to be a single, stable climax community that develops over time. It emphasizes the idea that ecosystems naturally progress toward a specific, final stage of development, which remains relatively constant unless disturbed. Next, we have the polyclimax theory. Unlike the monoclimax, this theory proposes that there isn't just one climax community, but multiple possible climax communities. These can vary based on factors like soil type, climate, and disturbance history, meaning different areas or conditions can support different stable communities. Then there's the mosaic theory. This concept views ecosystems as a patchwork or mosaic of different climax communities. Instead of a single uniform climax, the landscape is composed of various patches at different stages of succession, creating a diverse and dynamic environment. Finally, we have the vegetational gradient and climax pattern theory. This idea emphasizes the importance of gradual changes in vegetation along environmental gradients, such as moisture or temperature. It suggests that climax communities are not discrete but form a continuum, with transitions from one type to another, reflecting the influence of changing environmental conditions. Connecting all these points, it's clear that understanding these theories helps us grasp the complexity of ecological succession and the formation of stable communities in nature. Each theory offers a different perspective on how ecosystems develop and stabilize over time. Today, I want to introduce you to the monoclimax theory, which is a key concept in understanding ecological succession. Essentially, this theory suggests that all successions within a particular region will eventually lead to the same final stage. And importantly, this final stage is determined primarily by the region's climate. So, no matter where you start, whether it's a bare rock or a disturbed forest, the natural progression will guide the ecosystem toward a climatically controlled climax community. This idea was first proposed by Clement back in 1916, and it highlights how climate acts as a sort of blueprint for the ultimate stable state of an ecosystem. Connecting this to our overall theme, the monoclimax theory emphasizes the predictability and uniformity of ecological succession in a given climate, helping us understand how ecosystems evolve over time. It reminds us that climate isn't just a background factor. It's a driving force shaping the final structure of ecological communities. So let's delve into the polyclimax theory, specifically Tansley's version of it. This theory suggests that within a larger climax region, there might actually be several different climax communities. In other words, instead of a single, uniform climax, there could be multiple stable communities coexisting, each adapted to specific conditions within the region. Now, one conceptual challenge with this idea is that it's more scientifically sound to define spatial relationships using a strictly geographic concept. That means looking at actual physical locations and boundaries rather than more abstract or physiographic factors. Additionally, it's important to recognize that community stability doesn't always perfectly match physiographic stability. Just because a landscape or physiographic feature remains stable, it doesn't necessarily mean the community living there remains unchanged or stable as well. Connecting this back to the overall theme, understanding these nuances helps us appreciate the complexity of ecological stability and how different models attempt to explain the diversity of climax communities in nature. Let's take a closer look at the mosaic theory, which is associated with Aubreville. What this idea emphasizes is that a climax isn't actually a static point of equilibrium. Instead, it's more like a dynamic community that's constantly evolving. There are periodic changes and alterations in its components, meaning the community is always in flux. This perspective helps us understand that natural systems are not fixed, but are in a continuous state of adjustment. Connecting this to the overall theme, it highlights the importance of viewing ecological and social systems as adaptable and resilient, rather than static. This dynamic view allows us to appreciate the ongoing processes that shape communities over time. Let's talk about the vegetational gradient as proposed by Whittaker. This concept helps us understand how plant communities change across different environments. Now, an important point here is the role of physiographic stability. It influences the vegetation, but it doesn't lead to a single, fixed climax community for an area. Instead, what we see is a dynamic balance. Think of it as a combination of factors rather than a fixed endpoint. The climax isn't just about climate alone. It's also shaped by site factors like the terrain and physical features, as well as soil conditions. Then there are species factors. What types of plants are capable of thriving here, and biotic factors, which include interactions among organisms. So, the overall picture is that the vegetation we observe is the result of this complex interplay. No area has an absolute climatic climax because these various factors are constantly influencing and modifying the community structure. This helps us understand how ecosystems are more flexible and adaptive than a simple, linear progression toward a single climax. It's a fascinating reminder of the intricate balance in natural environments. Now, let's take a closer look at the classification of climax. We have several types, starting with the primary climax and disclimax. The primary climax is the final stable stage of an ecosystem, where the community has reached its maximum development. Disclimax, on the other hand, occurs when this stability is disrupted, often due to external factors like human interference or climate change. Moving on, we have the climatic climax, which is determined primarily by the climate of the region. An example of this is the fire climax, where frequent fires shape the community, like in certain grasslands or savannas. There's also the fire subclimax, which is a stage that occurs temporarily after a fire, but the community can recover and return to its climatic climax over time. Next, the edaphic climax depends on soil conditions rather than climate. For instance, in areas with poor or specific soil types, the vegetation community stabilizes accordingly. Preclimax refers to an earlier stage in succession. It's like the community just before reaching the climax stage. Conversely, the post-climax stage signifies the community after the climax has been established, often involving some ongoing changes. We also have the topodaphic climax, which takes into account terrain and soil factors together, shaping the climax community. The biotic climax is the stage where living organisms dominate, and the community is in a balanced, self-sustaining state. Overall, understanding these different types helps us grasp how ecosystems develop and respond to various influences, which is crucial when studying ecological succession and stability. The primary climax is interesting because it's not affected by fire or biotic pressure. This means that once an ecosystem reaches this stage, it remains relatively stable despite certain disturbances. Now, moving on to the climatic climax, this is where climate factors play a crucial role. These climatic elements, like rainfall and temperature, work together with biotic pressures such as plants and animals present in the area. An example of this would be the southern tropical wet evergreen forest, which is shaped by the specific climate conditions of that region. Understanding these two types of climax helps us see how different factors influence ecosystems and their stability over time. Now, let's talk about the concept of edaphic climax. This refers to a type of climax that occurs primarily due to the influence of specific soil factors. In other words, it's not just climate that determines the final stage of succession, but the particular characteristics of the soil itself. This type of climax happens in soils that are different from those associated with the climatic climax. For example, in southern tropical regions, you might find wet bamboo forests, which are a good illustration of edaphic climax. These bamboo breaks thrive in certain soil conditions that favor their growth, even if the climate might support a different kind of climax vegetation. So the key idea here is that soil properties, like moisture, nutrients, and texture, can lead to a unique, stable vegetation community that might differ from the overall climatic climax. Recognizing this helps us understand the diversity and complexity of ecological succession, especially how local soil conditions can shape the final vegetation community. Let's talk about the preclimax stage now. At this point, the plant community is actually just before the climatic climax of the region, meaning it's the stage right before the final, stable community that the environment supports. An interesting point here is that the site conditions tend to be drier than what we usually see in the region's climate. This dryness influences the types of plants that can thrive at this stage. For example, you might find pure patches of Anogesis latifolia growing within sal forest areas. These patches are characteristic of the preclimax stage, showing how certain species adapt to slightly drier conditions and are part of the transitional community leading to the climax. Understanding this stage helps us see how plant communities evolve and respond to environmental factors as they progress toward stability. Let's dive into the concept of topographic climax. This occurs when the physical features of the landscape, like steep slopes or specific aspects, create a unique microclimate that significantly influences the vegetation. Essentially, The terrain itself shapes a distinctive environment that supports certain plant communities, different from those in the surrounding areas. For example, a steep slope facing a particular direction can lead to specific sunlight exposure and moisture conditions, resulting in a specialized climax community. Moving on to post-climax, this refers to plant communities that are even more specific than the typical climatic climax you might expect for a region. These communities develop under exceptionally favorable site conditions within that region, such as sheltered valleys or nutrient-rich soils. An interesting example is the presence of evergreen and semi-evergreen species thriving amidst dry deciduous vegetation. These are more demanding in terms of their growth conditions and indicate the influence of highly favorable local factors. Connecting these ideas, both topographic and post-climax communities highlight how local environmental conditions, whether shaped by the land's physical features or exceptionally good site conditions, can lead to specialized and often more complex vegetation patterns. This understanding helps us see how diverse and intricate plant communities can be, driven by factors beyond just climate. Let's explore the concept of climax, starting with the topographic climax. This type of climax occurs primarily due to topographic and edaphic factors. For example, on steep slopes or areas with rocky soils, the environment creates unique conditions that lead to a specific kind of climax community. The terrain and soil characteristics essentially shape what kind of vegetation can thrive there, influencing the final stable stage of succession. Moving on to the biotic climax, this is driven by biological or living factors within the ecosystem. It's also often called the subclimax because it can be maintained by the dominant species present. For instance, in moist conditions, the presence of certain trees like Terminalia helps establish a stable community. The biotic interactions, such as competition and symbiosis, play a vital role in maintaining this climax state. Connecting this to our overall theme, understanding these different types of climax helps us appreciate how diverse ecological factors, whether physical or biological, interact to shape the final, stable stage of an ecosystem's development. Both topographic and biotic climaxes highlight the complex interplay of environmental and living factors in ecological succession. All right, let's talk about the concept of disclimax. A disclimax occurs when a climax community, which is typically the stable, mature stage of an ecosystem, is actually maintained or triggered by disturbances caused by humans or domestic animals. This means that instead of reaching a natural and undisturbed climax, the ecosystem remains in a state that's influenced by these external disturbances. Now, within this category, we have something called fire climax. This is a situation where repeated burning of vegetation actually maintains the community. So, instead of allowing the vegetation to grow undisturbed and reach its natural climax, frequent fires keep the environment in a kind of perpetual early or mid-successional stage. This repeated burning can prevent the development of a mature forest or other climax community, essentially shaping the landscape in a way that favors fire-adapted species. Understanding these concepts helps us see how human activities and even domestic animals can significantly influence ecological succession and community stability. It's a reminder that disturbances aren't always accidental. They can become integral to the ecosystem's structure over time. Now, let's move on to the fire subclimax. In areas where fire is a regular occurrence, whether it's annual or just common, the vegetation tends to consist of fire-hardy species. These plants are specially adapted to survive and even thrive under these conditions, ensuring the ecosystem maintains a certain stability despite the frequent fires. Next, we have the zoidic climax. This type of climax is maintained primarily through heavy grazing. When animals graze intensively, they keep the vegetation in check, preventing it from overgrowing and leading the ecosystem toward a stable, climax community. Connecting these points to the overall theme, both fire and grazing serve as natural regulatory mechanisms. They help shape and sustain specific climax communities, highlighting how different environmental pressures influence ecosystem development and stability over time. Thank you so much for your time and attention today. I really appreciate the opportunity to share these insights with you. As we've discussed throughout this presentation, understanding these key concepts can truly make a difference in how we approach our work and solve problems. Remember, the main takeaway is to stay curious, keep learning, and apply these ideas thoughtfully. I hope you found this session helpful and inspiring. Once again, thank you for being here and for your engagement. I look forward to seeing how you'll use this knowledge moving forward.